Okay, I think we can get started now. Thanks everybody for joining us for another DevCast. This is Ali from the Genesys Developer Support Team. Today, my fellow teammates, Agnes Corpuz and Prince Merluza, are going to teach you about the recording API for Genesys Cloud. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. If you want, you can ask questions at any time throughout the webinar tutorial by using the Q&A section on Zoom. Please don't use the chat for questions, just because we've got the resources listed there for the recording API, the tutorials and the help docs. And this session is being recorded, so I will send it to everyone and absentees afterwards. Without further ado, take it away, Agnes.
Thank you for that introduction, Ali. So I'm Agnes. Hello, everyone. I've been a software developer for more than 8 years now, and I've been with Genesys for more than 2 years. I'm here to present to you how to download the recordings to your local directory. I'm also here with my colleague, Prince.
Hey, I'm Prince, and I've been with Genesys for almost 3 years now. I was part of the professional services before and then transferred to our team, the developer ecosystem strategy. And I'm here to introduce you to the new feature of Pure Cloud, which allows bulk export or deletion of recordings.
So what are the use cases for downloading the recordings? First off is to improve customer experience. You can use that through speech analytics, sentiments analytics, quality assurance, and transcription. You can also improve employee experience by training purposes. So for our agenda for tonight, we are going to discuss how to download the recordings to your local directory and the code demo for Node.js. We will also discuss how to export to AWS S3 Bucket. This is the Genesys Cloud enhancement, the code demo for Node.js, and Genesys Cloud configuration demo. And finally, we will kick off with the Q&A section. So as we have mentioned a while ago, there are two ways to download the recordings. The first is to save to your local directory. This one is pretty manual, wherein you have to call different APIs so that you can achieve the recordings. This also has individual recording URLs for download, but it has more storage options. You can also save it to an external storage. But the limitation for this approach is that the date interval should not exceed 7 days. But also, it only takes a few minutes to download.
Okay, so for the new feature, which is the AWS S3 Bucket, the main difference is that there are two ways we could do this. It can either be automatic or manual. So later, I'm going to show you how to do it the automatic way, which means that you don't have to code a single line. We're just going to configure some things in the Pure Cloud org for it to automatically export our recordings. But of course, you can also use the API in order to export those recordings yourselves. And unlike the previous method, you can only export it to S3 Bucket for now. And for every export or every job that you request, there are no limitation on date. So you can request up to a year or even years worth of conversation and then have it exported to your S3. Now, one of the limitations or just unexpected delay is once that job is accepted or executed, it can take about 24 hours for your recordings to show up in your S3.
So how to download the recordings to your local directory? So for this demo, we are going to use the platform SDK APIs. So for the OAuth, we are going to use the client credentials grant type. So we will need the client ID and the client secret. We also need to use the conversations API and the recordings API. So I will show you the code. So this is the code for the downloading to the local directory. You can also see this in the tutorial sections in the Developer Center. So once we run this, it will start to create a recordings folder. So all the recordings will be downloaded in this recordings folder. So back to the presentation. So first, we are going to call the post analytics conversations details query. We are going to call this function so that we could get the conversation IDs. Again, this would be the limitation for this kind of approach, as this specific API only accepts 7 days of the date intervals. So once we have called this method, we will be getting the conversation IDs for that specific date range. So once we have the conversation IDs, we can now call the get conversation recording metadata of the recording API. So please also note that this API does not return a playable media. So for calling this API, we are going to need the conversation ID as an input, and the output would be the recording ID, which is the ID property of the result object. So once we now have the recording ID, we can now call the post recording batch requests. This just submits a batch download request for the recordings. So we need the conversation and the recording IDs for this specific input. Please also note that for each conversation ID, there might be multiple recording IDs. So you have to put into your code or do multiple API calls for different recording IDs and conversation IDs. So once we call this API, we will have the job ID. That the job ID would be the ID property of the result object. And once we now have the job ID, we can now call the get recording batch request API. So this just gets the status and results of the batch request job. We would need the job ID for the input of this API, and then the output would be the result URL and the content type. Please also note that if in case that you call this API and then the expected result count and the result count does not match, and the results object is null, it only means that the recording is not yet ready for download. So once we now have the results object, we can now get the request URL and the content type. So for the code of the logic, we need to get the content type because we need that to determine the file extension. So for chat interactions, having the content type as application or JSON, we might want to save that as a .txt file. And for voice interactions, for content types of audio or OGG, we might want to save that as a .ogg file extension. Also in your code, you need to create a directory to store the downloaded recordings. Afterwards, you can now download the recordings using the individual URLs to your created directory. Again, for a step-by-step instructions, you can visit our tutorial at this link. It is also in the chat interaction. So now back to the codes, so we can see the downloaded recordings. So right now, it only downloaded one audio type. So that sums up the tutorial on how to download the recordings and save to your local directory. I will now pass the mic to Prince.
Okay, hello. So as Agnes mentioned, that was the traditional way or the manual way of getting the recordings, and then you'll be able to download them through their individual URLs. So a lot of the clients requested this one for the bulk export or bulk deletion of recordings. And so this has been implemented by Pure Cloud developers. So I'm going to introduce you to export to AWS S3 Bucket. Now, if you remember earlier, I've mentioned that there are two ways that we could go ahead and implement this. It can either be the automatic or manual using the API. For the automatic, we'll go ahead to our Pure Cloud org. So I'm going to pull up our test org here. And we'll need to configure a few things that we would need for this to work. The main thing is we'll need to add the AWS S3 Bucket integration under the integrations. So if you can see here, I'm going to go to our integrations. and then go ahead and add a new one, which is the AWS S3 recording bulk actions integration. Okay, so as you can see here, it actually mentioned that it reached the maximum number of integrations. That's because we already have one configured in our org, which is this one. So if you can see, I'm going to click it and check the configuration, just to give you a brief summary of what you would need to configure. So in order to configure this integration, there are of course two sides, the pure cloud side and the AWS side. Now for this DevCast won't be able to show you our AWS side because it contains some information, but Ali already posted a Pure Cloud Resource Center article which details it step by step. So it's very comprehensive, it's very simple, and the gist of it is basically create an S3 bucket, create a role with permissions, and then that's it. You can now configure this side on the Pure Cloud. So if you're looking here in the configurations, you can see the properties. First is the S3 bucket. This is the name of the S3 bucket that you have created on your AWS side. The public key is optional if you want encryption, but for now we're going to leave it blank. And the next thing is of course the credentials, so that this integration would be able to connect your Amazon Web Services. It just needs the rule ARN, which again would be generated once you've configured this on your AWS. Once you've created a role in your AWS, you're going to put it here. If there are any errors and issues, then you won't get this check mark. So if you get the green check mark, that means everything is configured properly and we're ready to proceed. So we've done configuring the integration. Now for the automatic part, it's actually dependent on the policy. For those not familiar, policies is actually a way for Pure Cloud to implement actions on conversations automatically. So I'm going to click the policies option here under quality. Okay. Let me just select the one that we've configured before. So for this specific policy, I'm going to go ahead and scroll through the options. So there is a criteria. So you want conversations of a specific type. For this policy, it's inbound and outbound and going through a specific queue. And then you can select which actions you want to perform. So in this actions, we've actually selected for it to be exported with the integration. So as you can see here, it will show us the integration that we've configured before. So you need to configure the integration first and then set up a policy. Once that's done, you don't have to configure anything. So every time a conversation goes through this policy or matches this policy, then it will automatically export those recordings to your S3. So that's pretty simple. If you have any questions, we'll go through the Q&A afterwards. But I'm going to introduce you to the other way, which is using the API or using, programmatically executing the AWS S3 export. Okay. So here are the requirements for doing this through the API. Again, on our sample, we're using client credentials with the ID and secret, and we're using the recording API. If you notice, we're no longer using the conversations API to get conversations. So we won't need to get the conversation IDs. We don't have to do that manually anymore. We're going to use just the recording API. So for the first step is actually we need to create a recording bulk job. So I'm going to just discuss the different properties here that you would need in order to request the job. So for the first is the action. So there are two options here. It's either export or delete. So it's self-explanatory. Export is for exporting it to your S3, and then delete will delete it from your Pure Cloud org. The action date is when the actual action would be run. So if you can see here, if I put in here 2029, then it would wait until that date before it will be exported. And for the integration ID, this is actually the ID of the integration that we've made earlier. So let me just go back to our Pure Cloud UI to show you where you can get that ID. Okay, so I'm going back to admin and then going back to our integrations. Of course, you can also use the API to just pull this up, but using the UI, you can actually see the ID right on the URL itself. Okay. So that would be the ID that goes to our input here. And then you have an option if you want to include the screen recordings. And here's the conversation query. And like I mentioned, we're not using the conversations API. The query itself is inside the post recording jobs under recording API. So for the interval, you don't have to worry about like maximum limitation. You could just put in your years, months, or days, depending on what you would need. And of course, you can also order this. You can select which order you want it to show. Once you've submitted this request, then you would be, a response will come back to you, which would contain the job ID and the other state or the other details of that particular job. The initial state would be pending. What that means is it's actually starting to determine the conversations based on your query and the recordings of those conversations. So it will stay on pending, and then once it determines the number of conversations, the number of recordings, then it will be changed to ready. So you don't have to do anything there. What you might want to do is you're going to call this endpoint. So this endpoint is we're getting the state of the job. So you have the job ID, and then we're going to get the job. You're just going to poll it every few seconds, maybe 2 seconds. And then once you see that it is ready, then we could go ahead and proceed. Take note that, as you can see here, it's already ready, and we already have the details of how many conversations we have and how many recordings we're expecting from those conversations. And then, as I mentioned, since we're now ready, we're ready to proceed to the next step, which is to execute the recording bulk job. So the input is pretty simple. We just need to send an object with a state of processing. There's really no other input that it accepts. And then it will bring us back, again, the job details, but the state would now be updated to processing. So that, again, you'll just have to wait for it. It will happen automatically. While it's processing and you call the get recordings job API, then you'd be able to see the percent progress. As you can see here, if you can see my cursor, it will show you the total processed recordings and the percent progress of those recordings. So you can just get the update from time to time. By the way, so I just went back to this same slide, and once that's done, the state should update to fulfilled. What that means is all of the recordings has been processed. It is now ready to be exported. Okay. Now, the export itself does not happen. The export or delete does not happen until the action date. So that's kind of a note that is important. Even if it's fulfilled, then the action date will be followed. Now, if you remember, you've set that action date beforehand, like before you requested the bulk job. If you accidentally set a date that was past, like you've put in there 2019, then don't worry, it will not result in an error. It will just automatically export it right when the state is fulfilled. But if you set it on a future date, then it will only execute this action on that specific date. If that's clear. So on the tutorial that's also linked, we also showed the different endpoints available on the new recording API. So of course, you can also get the different recording jobs if you want to manage them or track them. So the input would just be your query, page size, the sorting, and the state. You can also only show jobs that you yourself have created, and the job type. Again, it's either export or delete. And then it will just give you back the different jobs. Another thing, so if you made a mistake in creating a job, you want to delete it, then there's also the delete recording job. You would just need the job ID. And as long as the action date or the actual process hasn't been started yet, then you could delete it so it won't go through anymore. Okay. So, and there's a step-by-step instruction and a tutorial on our developer center. I believe this link is also in our chat. So be sure to check that out. And well, I'm going to show you before I end this, I'm just going to show you how it would look like on the S3 side. We've tested this and basically the recordings would go to your bucket. So if you can see here, this is our AWS S3 bucket. So once the recordings are successfully exported, then you can see that they are arranged by the year. So let me just pick one here. Roland just sent that he can see the link. I will be sending it. Yeah.
Sorry, I sent it before the meeting, everybody.
So sorry about that. So if we, like I mentioned, so this is our S3 bucket. So you'd be able to see the year, the month, the day of those recordings, and by the hour. And then finally, you can see the conversation ID and the recording and the metadata that's included with that recording. So that's how you execute the AWS S3, both automatic and manual. And I believe we could proceed now to our code, which is actually the same as the one in the tutorial. So this code just shows all of the endpoints that I mentioned earlier. So let's give it a run. Hold on. Okay. So if you can follow my cursor, you can see that the action here is delete instead of export. So we're trying to delete the recordings of this specific interval. And if you look on the right side, we've created that recording bulk job, and now we're polling for the state. We're just checking if it's still pending and if it's successfully ready. So so while we're checking that and it became ready, then we will now execute that job, which is this line of code. So once you've executed the job, then it will wait, as I mentioned earlier, it would wait for the action date, which is determined here, okay? By the way, for this example, after executing the recording bulk job, we just go ahead and canceled it. We did not really want to delete those recordings. So we canceled the job, and then the last lines that you see here is the result of get recording jobs or get the jobs on the org. Okay. So yes, so that's how you implement those, and I believe we're ready to proceed to our Q&A. If you have any questions, if you want any clarifications on any of the things that we've discussed.
Prince, Roland had a question. Can we schedule a job for a specific queue when using a new recording job?
Hello. So yeah, I got a question from Roland. Hi, can we schedule a job for a specific queue when using the new recording job? Yes, definitely can. If if you remember, I showed you the policy earlier. So you can actually select a specific queue on that policy, and then it will automatically, oh, I'm sorry. So you mentioned you want to schedule. Then you'd have to do it on the code itself. So in your code, you could, let me see, hold on.
Hey, Prince.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that clarification. So for now, actually, hold on. So the recording API just gives you gives you control over the conversation interval. So if you want to limit it by a specific queue, then it would be done through the policy that I've shown earlier. Yep. So he asked another question. At this moment, there is no way to see the jobs in Genesys Cloud, right? If it's a job that's created by a user, then you'd be able to see it using the API that I've mentioned before. But if it's created by a policy, then no, you won't be able to see it on the get recording jobs.
Does anybody else have any questions about how to use the recording API or about the new AWS S3 bulk export? Let's see. Katrina has a question. Will the recording be available within 24 hours?
Which one are we talking about? Is it the old method or the new recording API?
She didn't specify, but what could you answer for both?
Sure. So for the old one, as mentioned, demonstrated earlier, as long as it's already available, then you'd be able to download it using the URL. But for the new one, as long as the action date occurs, then it will start the export. Now, I believe I mentioned this before, but on the back end, of course, Pure Cloud AWS is going to send it to your S3 bucket. There can actually be a delay of up to 24 hours. So after the action date, you might have to wait maximum 24 hours for it to show up on your S3.
Okay, great, thank you. I don't think that, it doesn't sound like there's any more questions. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to developersupport@genesys.com or visit our the developer center at developer.mypurecloud.com. We have a forum there, a lot of great people answering questions. Otherwise, feel free to, I had to resend the links to the tutorials and the API and whatnot in the chat, so that's there. But I will also email that to you along with the recording roughly 24 hours after this meeting. So unless anyone has any further questions, I think we can call it a day. All right, it looks like we're good. So thanks everybody again for joining, and we will see you hopefully next month. All right, thanks Prince and Agnes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.